Hey friends, Kambria Evans here with the Zero Disturbance podcast, and today we're continuing our series, Dumb Things Therapists Say. Now, this series, if you're just joining us, is to highlight all of the lifelong learning that we get to do, not just as therapists, but as clients in therapy as well. Because what's so exciting about the field of psychology is that we are constantly evolving and constantly learning. A lot of the things we used to think didn't work, were unsafe, or were the best thing ever, those concepts and frameworks are changing, and they're changing really, really fast. And so today I'm going to talk about safety, because I think that it's important when we get a little overwhelmed by all the different modalities we can use for treatment, we can come back to this concept of safety, right? Because we've all committed to do no harm, right? And this concept of safety is really interesting to me, not just as a therapist, but also as a person in therapy. And what I notice as a therapist and as a client is that I kind of think about safety in two different buckets, right? The first one is when you realize you're in a situation that is so unsafe that you have to leave it. You have to leave it because it is just unbearable to sustain in it. So during the pandemic, during COVID, I had a lot of healthcare workers in my practice, and it was so unsafe and so traumatic. A lot of them left the bedside. A lot of them took a sabbatical, took a break because it was too much, right? You'll notice that with lots of people that are in domestic violence situations, oftentimes they'll leave when they realize it's gotten insane. It's too much. This is so unsafe. Whatever I thought was worth staying in this relationship or staying in this house, it's not worth it, okay? So those are one way to think about safety with those two examples. Another way to think about safety is realizing how unsafe you used to feel when you were in a situation, right? It's almost like you don't realize how unsafe you felt until you have some distance from it. So you might be growing up in a house with your parents or caregivers thinking we're just normal, we're just kind of, bouncing along. And it's not until you're an adult that you realize, wow, some really weird stuff was going on in that house. Like, that wasn't okay. I actually didn't feel very safe as a kid. And it kind of disorients us. It disorients us as adults to go back and see that now, because we are able to see it with the current safety of the present time, right? When we're kids, we don't have any power. We don't have any choices. We don't have any agency or control. We are literally just figuring out how to get secure attachment, how to get any connection, how to get any safety that's available to us. And kids are amazingly skilled at figuring this out. They're so creative and so talented. So I think about those concepts of safety, right? I realize I'm unsafe in the moment, so I change it. And I'm now realizing I was feeling very unsafe, and now I have to process it. So I think for me as a client in my own therapy work, doing EMDR and Brainspotting with my therapist, I've noticed a lot of lack of safety in my past. And as a mom, I think about, with my twins, they're about to be 8, I think a lot about how to give them safety now and how to internalize safety inside of them with secure attachment. I think about this all the time. And I think what's so interesting is that we have these ways of staying safe out in the world that I think have been taken away from a lot of us, especially women. I think when you realize that you're a woman who has been in an unsafe situation, and I'm only speaking about this because I am a woman, big questions come up. Like, what is safety? What does it mean to be powerful? What does it mean to have our anger available to us because we know anger is protective, right? If we're raging and protecting something vulnerable, it's an indicator oftentimes that we don't feel safe. And I think this concept of power is interesting too. I think a lot with my female clients in particular around, are you allowed to feel powerful? Because your power is actually something that will keep you safe. And if women are programmed to not want to be powerful because that's not okay, or that's not attractive, or that's not what women do, or whatever the messaging is in society, we are actually teaching women to not keep themselves safe in a lot of ways. So I think about safety a lot. And what's interesting as an EMDR therapist is that we are taught in our training, how to keep our clients safe, how to do no harm. And around that, some really interesting questions come up, like, can I do EMDR on somebody who's pregnant? Okay, if y'all have seen my interview before with Mara Tessler-Stein, the answer is yes. And there's this question of ethics, right? If you don't give somebody access to something that helps them feel safer, that helps them decrease trauma, that helps them feel more resource, are you actually part of the problem as the clinician if you are saying, nope, that's too dangerous? I think we're quick to say that as clinicians because we know how powerful and effective EMDR can be, especially Brainspotting as well. And I think we do a disservice sometimes to our clients by being too safe, meaning we aren't ready to process phase 4 yet. They're not ready. They're dissociating. We can't do phase 4 trauma processing. They're not stable yet. We can't process any trauma in phase 4. They're not sober yet. We can't do this. So there's all these rules that we're taught as EMDR therapists around how to make sure we're safe with our clients. And I want to say that the intention of these rules is really good. It's really important. I'm all on board with keeping people safe. And I get curious about when are we making decisions to not provide treatment to somebody who would feel safer and would be safer if we decrease their trauma or if we resource them differently, right? And so something I've been thinking a lot about is this movement with psychedelics. And what I want to say about that is, first and foremost, I am one of the biggest rule followers there ever was. I remember when I first came across EMDR, I don't know, over a decade ago, I heard about it and I thought to myself, that sounds ridiculous. And I noticed all of this judgment come up in myself. And I noticed how I just thought, well, this is the way that you do therapy, right? Like talk therapy. I can do parts work, I can do this, but I can do CBT, right? I can be humanistic and, psychodynamic. But what is this EMDR? It sounds ridiculous, right? And then what did I do as a responsible clinician? I went and looked at the research and it was incredible. What did I do as a responsible clinician? I went and took the training because I wanted to see it for myself, right? Because I am an applied anthropologist by nature. I want to try everything on myself to make sure that it's legit. And I'll never forget in my basic EMDR training, in the practicum portion, feeling EMDR shifting me in real time in a way that talk therapy never, ever could. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm never not going to use this again. I'm only going to be an EMDR clinician. This is incredible. And it's this interesting process, not just for clinicians, but for everyone, to notice how something new or different comes into the conversation as something that could create safety for someone or healing. It's interesting to notice how our brains categorize things so quickly. Well, this is different. This is bad. This is unsafe, right? I had that experience just with EMDR therapy before I researched it, before I learned about it, and before I tried it on myself. Let's talk about Brainspotting. If you are immersed in the EMDR community as an EMDR clinician, you have probably heard this messaging that, well, Brainspotting is not EMDR, and Brainspotting is not as good as EMDR, and EMDR is the best. Like all this kind of like cultish language around how great EMDR is and how everything's down here. And that messaging, right, gives us this idea in our brain to categorize Brainspotting as bad. Brainspotting is not legitimate, right? Just the way talk therapy did with EMDR. When you go into grad school, you don't get trained in EMDR. You get trained in all the classic 100-year-old plus therapies. I don't know why that is, just the way it is. And then you learn about something different. And then that community does the same thing, right? So when I heard about Brainspotting, I was already trained in EMDR and I took on. I'm gonna fully admit this. And if you've done it too, you can admit it to yourself. It's a very uncomfortable place to be. I took on the belief of Brainspotting is silly, Brainspotting is stupid, Brainspotting is not as good as EMDR. I already have what I need. And guess what? I was so wrong. I was so wrong, like painfully wrong. And I think a lot about ethics and safety, and I think about, had I been more open-minded about new modalities coming in, not just for my own therapy, but for my patients, could I have helped people faster? Could I have given people more relief had I been more open to learning about new modalities? Could I have saved myself the stress of being a frustrated clinician who has tools in her toolbox that aren't quite getting to certain places? When I did the Brainspotting training, even during the training, I'm going to fully admit this, even during the training, I was like, I already know all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. I already know about trauma, right? But then what happened? I'm in the Brainspotting training with Lisa Larson. She's amazing in Southern California. And I'm doing it virtually. And we go into the practicum portion. And y'all, something happened to me that has never happened in over 40 years. I processed things subcortically in my body so fast, just from the Brainspotting, right? No EMDR, that I literally lost track of time. Time didn't exist. Nobody was pausing me every 60 to 90 seconds. What are you noticing now? What are you throw me back up into my cognitive mind? Nobody was interrupting me. And the power of Brainspotting has blown my mind. I think it's incredible. And what makes me really sad is this built-in judgment system that I had and still have. I'm still working on it. I made a quick decision because I took information from someone that I thought was an authority or an expert, or multiple people like that in my EMDR community. And I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust myself to use my own discernment to go and figure something out and learn with a fresh perspective in myself, right? I did that. I think a lot of therapists do that, unfortunately, and which is why I want to talk about it so openly, okay? So that brings us to the topic of psychedelics. Now, it is very disorienting to be somebody in your 40s who, when you hear about mushrooms, MDMA, ketamine, when you hear about these types of drugs, our brain links to something very different than using these substances in the therapy room, right? Because these drugs were available to people in high school or college or in their 20s to use recreationally, right? So already, because these drugs have been labeled bad and illegal, we already have this connotation about them. So noticing myself, noticing my own resistance to EMDR, my own resistance and judgment to Brainspotting, and then noticing how illuminating these tools are and how now I can't live without them, I'm trying to bring that process to light with all of you. I'm trying to have an open conversation with clinicians and clients too about how do we learn about what is safe? How do we learn about what can help us in the therapy room? And how do our own judgments and quick decisions in our brain, or stories we've heard from mentors or supervisors, or things we've linked to our past, how does that all mess us up? Basically, right? How does that get in our way? So when I had clients coming in my office asking me, Kambria, are you going to be offering MDMA? Are you going to be offering psilocybin? Are you going to be offering ketamine, right? I will completely own this. I was like, heck no, I am not touching that stuff with a 50-foot pole. First of all, liability. Second of all, that's insane. That's not what those drugs are for. And I saw the words come out and I thought, that's an interesting thing to decide, isn't it? Because the stakes are high. The stakes are very high when it comes to why people come into my office. And am I being in service to them if I'm not learning constantly about what's available to help people? And why have I been so comfortable with this idea that mood stabilizers, because they are legal and prescribed by physicians, why am I okay with those? Well, let's talk about it. Let's have an open conversation about it, right? Lexapro, Wellbutrin, all these drugs, I'm so grateful they exist. They help so many people in short-term situations, sometimes long-term. They helped tons of people through the pandemic, right? When there was no real safety in the present time to hold on to. But what's the problem with these drugs? I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not going to get into a whole thing about it, but here's what I'll say as a clinician, as an MFT. If we numb or take the edge off of sadness, we're likely also taking the edge off of feeling joy, right? If we numb or take the edge off of anxiety with a prescription mood stabilizer like Lexapro, right? We're likely also taking the edge off of and numbing joy, sexual pleasure, right? Aliveness, right? Just like when we decide to dissociate from part of us, we don't get to decide which part it is most oftentimes. It's just kind of all of us, okay? So there are limitations to these mood stabilizers. Do they create more safety? I think they do sometimes, and I'm glad that they exist. So then why have we decided, a lot of us in the clinical community, that psychedelics are unsafe and bad? Well, let's talk about it. Let's think about it. Because I don't want to make the same mistakes again. I don't want to push something away out of my clinical practice or my understanding as a clinician and harm people by not learning about it. I don't want to harm people by saying nope before I've researched it or tried it on myself. I'm not going to do that anymore. That's not responsible. I don't deserve to be sitting in this seat with my license, making those kinds of decisions that are so incompetent. That's not okay, right? What we do in EMDR is really interesting. We resource people in phase 2. We give them resources that are either real or imaginary, right? And why do we do this? We do this because we want them to have the experience of knowing what it feels like to feel loved. We want them to have the experience of knowing what it feels like to be safe, protected. We want to give them the experience of knowing what it feels like to feel like there's a wise, safe presence around them that knows what to do when they feel lost and confused. We literally do this in phase 2 of EMDR so people can feel resourced, because some people coming in have never felt loved by anybody. They don't even know what that feels like. They have to vicariously think about, like kittens and their mom cats cuddling to kind of absorb some of that nurturing energy. They haven't experienced it before in their actual real life. So we have to get really creative about resourcing, really creative. And guess what? Sometimes you have clients come in and they say, I'm not going to use imagination to resource myself. And even if I tell them, your brain doesn't care if something is real or imaginary, because somatically it's the same feeling, right? It's just like if I watch a TV show and I'm watching a character and that character is giving me lots of nurturing mother energy, right? It doesn't matter that that person's not really my mother. It doesn't matter because I'm having the felt experience of feeling loved and nurtured by that person, right? So we already understand in the community of EMDR, in the community of therapy, that resourcing somebody to have a felt experience is part of doing therapeutic work. And it is often important to have that in our toolbox so that when we go towards traumatic material that we want to reprocess with a brain-based therapy, we have these resources available for them in the room with me and out of the room. When they get anxious, when they feel lonely, when they get dysregulated, they have resources they can pull from. Things we've tried together so that they can have a felt feeling in their body of love and safety. Okay? So we already do this as clinicians. So when I'm learning about or hearing about things like psilocybin or MDMA, I'm asking myself, okay, instead of pushing these things away and not even learning about them, which is so irresponsible, right? How might these create safety? How might these help my clients feel things they've never felt before? What would it look like for me as a clinician to have this in my toolbox as a way to help someone feel nurtured, right? I spoke with somebody the other day who had an MDMA journey. And she was telling me, I sat there with this guide for 6 hours, and I just felt the most self-love I've ever felt in my entire life. It was like I could look at everything without judgment. I could go towards things I couldn't go towards. Now, They call this the love drug, right? Are there safety concerns about using this in the therapeutic room? 110%. And just like when we asked that question, is it safe to do EMDR with a pregnant person? Let's use some discernment here, okay? Let's use some discernment instead of categorizing a quick yes or no, safe or unsafe. There are lots of people that are going around microdosing mushrooms and reporting really great effects. There's tons of research on this, by the way, as well. And what I wanted to share with all of you is that, I hope as therapists, we change the conversation around how we're thinking about different modalities and different substances, right, to help our clients. I'm hoping that as clients in therapy, you might get curious about what resources are available to help you have a felt experience that might be easier to get to than sitting in the therapy room for weeks and weeks and months. And I really want us to think about the safety of learning before we make big decisions, right? So I wanted all of you to know that I have committed to a year-long program so that I can learn everything I can about psychedelic-assisted therapy. And I am so excited that I get to challenge myself, challenge my own limitations of what I think is safe or what I think is best or what I think is right. Because the truth is, I don't know. And me saying right now, I don't know, is the safest, most responsible thing I can do. And I'm looking forward over the next year as I learn all about psychedelics with other physicians, therapists, nurse practitioners, psychiatrists, to learn together in a cohort to understand what is this? What is available to us that can help our patients faster with more safety? I'm so excited about this. So if you are somebody, whether you're a therapist or a client, who has heard about psychedelics and you have noticed, like me, a quick judgment, I want you to ask yourself, do I know what I'm talking about? Because I don't know, right? And then ask yourself, is it my responsibility to understand what I'm saying no to? Is it my responsibility to understand what I'm judging before I judge it out loud? And am I being a safe therapist or a self-responsible client if I don't do these things? These are important questions to ask yourself. And here on the podcast, we always have thoughtful clinical conversations, don't we? So this is kicking off that conversation around psychedelics. I hope that you will participate in being curious with me about it. In a year from now, I might think it's all not worth it. But at least I will feel safe in myself as a person, as a clinician, to be clear about my answer because I've used my discernment to research and learn about something. So I hope you will join me in that process, not just about psychedelics, but about all things clinical. Whatever can help us. Let's be open-minded and let's be safe together. In the meantime, I hope y'all take care of yourselves and I will look forward to being together next time on the podcast. Be well.